Today we're going to talk a little bit about profiling, and this is part one. What is profiling? And really, before we even get to profiling, why are we profiling? The main purpose of the whole effort is to try to make the game run faster, to try to optimize. And there's sort of a general rule of thumb called the 80-20 rule. In general, 80% of the time is going to be spent in just 20% of your code. So before you go around trying to optimize things, it's a good idea to first figure out where that 20% really is. And I want to caution you against trying to reason your way through this. Sometimes your assumptions may be very, very wrong on this. Something that seems like it's likely to be a real bottleneck may turn out to not be the issue at all. So I always advise, approach this scientifically, find out precisely where the slow parts are, and then use your time wisely working on that area first. Now, how do we find out what the slow parts are? That is what profiling is. So the first thing you want to do is look at where your bottleneck is. Like maybe you have multiple threads. Like for example, here's a game that has three main threads. We have a rendering thread, we have this rendering thread, we have this game thread, and we have this physics thread. And the game can't advance until all those threads have finished doing their thing, right? So as you can see in this example, I can optimize the physics system until the cows come home. It's not gonna help, because in this case, my bottleneck turns out to be the rendering system. So I gotta optimize that render thread somehow if I want this thing to speed up. Okay, we are talking about profiling, so let's see an example of a real-life profiler in action here. This is Unity, and I've got a game, sample game running in Unity. Let's try to get a little profile of this. Sort of imagine what we would do if we thought the game was running a little too slow. We open up the profiler window. It was just right here under Window, Analysis, Profiler. And it pops it up like there. And it comes up recording our profile. And then we get a recording for a while and then say, okay, that's enough. I'm going to pause the game and let's analyze what we found a little bit. First of all, I can click on a frame here and it'll analyze that frame for me. This is at the top here. We have a history of how the speed was going, and I'll look at a pretty typical. I'm going to say there's a typical frame there, pretty typical. And on that frame, this is a hierarchical frame timing system that very similar to what we're going to make in the lab. So what do we see here? We see that something, the player loop ran for a while, and then there's a gap where apparently it's running editor code. And then here's player loop again. What we see the difference though is underneath this is camera render. So this is the rendering going on, and then this is the update. This is the enemies running their little behavior scripts and so forth. And then down here is the actual render thread. And there's apparently we can see here the main thread and the render thread. Very typical arrangement to do that. And the render thread seems to take about the same amount of time, maybe a little bit longer than the player thread does. So that's what we can see right away. The first question you usually want to ask, say always, for the first question you want to ask when profiling, am I CPU limited or GPU limited? That means like the GPU and the CPU, two different chips, two different processors on the computer. The GPU is rasterizing triangles, it's transforming vertices, it's running shaders. The CPU is just doing like everything else. So you want to ask first, am I bottlenecked by these slow shaders that I've written? Do I need to optimize those shaders? Or maybe I'm bottlenecked by physics and it doesn't matter what I'm doing with my shaders, right? So that's why you want to know right off the bat which one of those it is. Okay, so from this we can see, here's the CPU usage, here's the GPU usage, And on this particular frame that I have highlighted, I'm showing a total of, I don't know, it looks like about 5 milliseconds of this, and like 1 millisecond of that. So I'm not GPU limited in this case. Doesn't look like I'm GPU limited at all. Although frankly, on my development machine here, I'm not limited at all. I'm running super fast, right? As long as I'm on this, caveat, you should be profiling on your target hardware. This is a cell phone game that I'm demonstrating here, and so that's why it runs so fast on my beefy development machine. I should really be hooking this up to a cell phone and profiling it on that hardware to see how it really runs. But this is just an example for class. Okay, so we have our hierarchical system, we have our history. You can use the history to find spikes. Like, it's not totally even. There's bumps, bumpity bumps. And the underlying bumps seem to be in this dark green color here. You'll notice it's color coded, and this will allow us to show what those are. Like, I don't want to see that one. That's this one. This big bump is in this category. Most of the bumpiness is in that category, and that is filed under others, which doesn't tell us a whole lot, except that perhaps if we dig deeper, we'll see that it's probably this thing down here, which is labeled as profiler. So it's probably the profiler itself. And that is something else I should point out. Profiling, adding all those stopwatches and those timers and the creating of all of these charts takes time. So you're not going to get 100% fair profile of what's really happening. Part of this time that we're spending here is actually the profiler itself. And I think in this case, our game is so fast that the profiler is the bottleneck, and there's no need to optimize anything. But let's say there was something slow. Let's say we did have something down here, maybe this is where most of our code is, right? This is rendering code. So if we have a slowness here, either we try to optimize the engine, good luck to us, this is Unity, right? More likely, we try to optimize the drawing. We try to draw fewer things. But over here, we have plenty of control. This is behavior update, right? This is our code that we wrote. This is our scripts. So let's take a look at those. We have another option, the hierarchy view. And in the hierarchy view, we can see what happened during the time in sort of a breakdown this way, in like a, what would I call this? Kind of like a call stack. And basically, it's a call stack. And there's some interesting things, like total, how much of the time was spent in player loop? 45% of the time was spent in player loop. So that's the bulk of it. Certainly what I'm interested in. And we can open that up and see, how does that break down? So the biggest contributor was camera rendering, and I'm going to say, okay, I'm not going to try to optimize that. Let's look at this script behavior. 10% of the total time was in this particular script update behavior. What else have we got to look at that's big? 5% in updating canvases, more updating renderers and animation update, updating audio. So the big one, script behavior. And we can drill down further and open that up and see, oh, what are the expensive scripts? So let's say this character update. We can see here that character update was called 11 times for a total of 5% of the total time for this frame. What else can we see? How much memory was allocated there? Okay, we're not allocating any memory, that's good. And how much of the time in milliseconds? So 0.22 milliseconds of the total 2 milliseconds. So, and we're talking about 2 milliseconds here. Multiply by 10 to get a number maybe you care about, right? So maybe this is 20 milliseconds, and maybe this is 2 milliseconds, and now we'd start to care about that. Okay, so this lets us see that if we wanted to try to optimize this, the first place we'd want to look is to try to make character update run faster. And one other thing to point out here is that the time versus self. The self is how much was just in this timer, and the time is how much is in this timer, including all of its children. All of the right behavior update is 0.47 total, but of that, only 0.02 is actually in behavior update itself. The rest of the time is down here in these child components, and most of that is this character update. So that's how to use a profiler, and I hope that's helpful and useful for you to see where to focus your efforts. Now there are two main types of profiling. You can either do what's called an instrumented profile, or you could do sampling. Now see, with instrumented, what you do is you go in and you add something. You add some code probably, or perhaps you link against a library that is going to sort of inject code into your program. And the purpose of that code is to put markers and timers. So it times the different pieces of the code. The other way to go, and this is much easier to just get started, is a sampling profiler. Now, what a sampling profiler does is it just pauses the game periodically. So, for example, if you're running in the debugger and you just hit the pause button, it'll break into the debugger. It stops everything, and you can see where the call stack is. So what the sampling debugger does is it does that over and over and over again. It'll break in, record the call stack, resume. Break in, record the call stack, resume. And do that maybe 1,000 times per second. Something like that. Just do it very frequently. And it records all that into a big buffer. And then when you tell it, okay, stop, it will scan through all of those call stacks that it recorded and tell you what functions it was in most often. See, the chances of it stopping in a function are much greater if it spends more time in that function. Makes sense. Okay, here's an example of an instrumented profile. This is from a real game. I got permission. This is from a game I was working on actually at Riot Games. Not League of Legends, one of their other things. I'm showing two things here. First of all, I instrumented it. I added timers to the code and wrote those timers out to a file. And then I opened that file with Chrome Trace. And this is what we're going to be doing in the lab. We're going to use the same thing, the same tool, Chrome Trace, to visualize the time. Okay. So all these little different colors represent individual little timers, little slices of time. Very hard to understand what you're looking at zoomed out like this. Let's zoom in on it, and Chrome Trace lets you do that. So here I have zoomed in on just one frame. This is frame number 600, and it starts right there and it ends right there. So you can see right here it's labeled as frame number 600. So that's just a single frame of the game, and we can see all the different timers that ran during that time. I have three main categories here. I have GPU, CPU1, and CPU2. So what am I seeing there? This is the GPU time. I've set up some GPU timers. That's the actual rasterization of polygons, transformation of vertices, that sort of thing. And then I have two different threads on the CPU that I just apparently labeled 1 and 2. Okay, so what else can we see here? We can see now that we've zoomed in, that we've got names on things, we've got colors on things, but also see how it's stacked from top to bottom. This is what's called a hierarchical profiler, meaning each one of these bars here is like a stopwatch. It's like a timer. So, I mean, for example, I started a timer called GPU frame. Started it right there, and it ran, and it ran, and it ran, and it ran, and then it stopped. I stopped it right there. What we're doing here is we're timing a piece of code. We're say like, okay, when a function begins, you say start the timer, and then you let the function run, and when the function is done, stop the timer. And then we'll spit that out and we'll see it here. But what else we see here, for example, pre-pass is a separate timer that started after GPU frame was already running. And that's because, you know, like one function calls another function, right? And that's what's going on here. This whole thing is the GPU frame timer. This piece is part of that. I've broken GPU frame into several smaller pieces. One called pre-pass, one called main pass. Here's something called transparent pass 2. And then those are further broken down and further broken down. Like, what do we got here? Main pass has something called light, and light has something called ambient light. So by looking at these things, I can sort of break it down and see where all the time is going. Okay, so that's, you know, looking at the GPU. These other two are CPU timers, and there's 2 threads of that. So let's get to trying to optimize this game. Now, the first thing I thought when looking at this thing, first thing I was going to try to optimize was the gameplay updates. Because in this game, every little thing updates every frame, and so there was some slow code in there that no real effort had been made to make it run fast. So that was my first thought. The gameplay update is going to be where I want to look. But when I got my time back, look at this. When you click on the things in Chrome Trace, when you click on these little bars, it gives you the name of the bar down here, and also tells you how long that bar ran for. This is this little bar here, GL_T_entity tick. That was this team's name for gameplay update. Took 0.3, less than 0.3 milliseconds. So not a lot at the time. Okay, tangent cam. Let's talk about milliseconds. I keep mentioning milliseconds. We tend to use milliseconds when we're talking about frame timers and optimizations. It's a good metric. We might be trying to run 16 frames per second. I'm sorry, I said 60 frames per second. We might be trying to run 60 frames per second, and we've heard that before. That would equate to 16.6 milliseconds. Or we might be trying to run 30 frames per second, in which case we have more time. We have 33.3 milliseconds to work with. So milliseconds makes a good timer benchmark to use for these things. And also, no, we don't talk in frames per second usually at this level. Some people do. I mean, the less technical people on your team are still going to be more comfortable talking in frames per second. How many frames per second is that? Is what you'll hear. But for the techies, the geeks who are in there trying to squeeze out milliseconds, that's the way we'll talk. Okay, so as it says right on here, optimizing this gameplay update isn't going to help me. So why is that? If we're in class together, I would say, okay, let's have some questions. Who has an answer? What we'll do here, just pause it for a moment, come up with what you think the answer is, and then hit resume. And we're back. Hopefully everyone has their ideas. Okay, so why would optimizing this little thing not help at all? The first most obvious answer is it is so small already that even if you cut it out completely, we're only saving 0.3 milliseconds. And we want more than that. There are much bigger fish to fry in here than this. So yeah, that's good. That's a good answer. But there's a better answer. If I can trim this out, if I can just eliminate it completely, the frame rate will not improve at all. Who saw why that is? Look at this thing here. Further on down this same thread, we have something called waiting for drawing frames. What does that mean? I mean, maybe you don't know, but looking around, this thing is called drawing thread. So this is waiting for drawing frames. What we're doing here is, at this point, CPU 1 has finished its work. and the game now just can't proceed until CPU 2 finishes its work. So therefore, optimizing anything in the CPU 1 thread will not help us in this situation. Instead, if you were looking to try and optimize this game, maybe focus down here on one of the larger chunks on CPU 2. Okay, that's it for part 1. There's a part 2 and then a part 3 after that. There's a link right down there in the description to take you to the next video, part 2. See you there.